It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Professor Lisa Herzog, and her work crosses many boundaries from political philosophy to economics to ethics in organizations. Her work is even groundbreaking in the sense that she uses empirical fieldwork along with normative theorizing in a very fruitful and inspiring way. She's an author of many books and articles, the latest of which is the Reclaiming the System, Moral Responsibility, Divided Labor and the Role of Organizations in Society, which came out from Oxford University Press last year. And she is starting in the University of Groningen in fall in the Department of Philosophy in the PPE Center. So congratulations for that as well. Our talk today is on Republican functionalism. So welcome, Professor Herzog.
Thank you very much for being here, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, which came as a bit of a surprise because I don't think I'm a social ontologist, although that's maybe debatable. Steph very kindly remarked this morning that my last book had social ontology in it, so who knows. But I come more from the normative angle, from political and moral and social philosophy, but I think we can't do without talking about things that I guess in the end are pretty ontological. So I'm very curious to hear what you'll say about my proposals here. Second qualification, this is very much work in progress. It's the beginning of a new project, so I'm looking forward to feedback to see how I can steer this in the right direction. And thirdly, this title may seem a bit weird to you. It's also a bit weird to me. I've been looking for a different one. Maybe it should be democratic institutionalism or republican institutionalism or something else. So nothing hinges on that, but I hope that at the end of my talk you'll understand what I mean by it and why I've chosen it. And maybe you have a better one. I'd be very grateful for proposals here. So what am I going to talk about? I'll start with some rather general reflections on normative political theorizing and some of the blind spots and the problems of abstraction that it has had in recent years. And I'm going to be a bit polemical, so forgive me that. But I think to get the big picture, that's actually quite helpful to be a bit polemical from time to time. Second, I'll talk about what I mean by Republican functionalism or democratic institutionalism or whatever as an alternative framework, which, as I said, brings together ontological considerations and normative considerations. And then I'll have a very sketchy application of what that kind of approach means for a field that I got very interested in and will work on in the future, namely the role of knowledge, expert knowledge, in democracies. And I'll give you a few hints and you can ask me more questions in the Q&A. So, if you look at the world out there, there's a lot of talk of a crisis of democracy. There seems to be a lot of discontent with existing institutions. There is all this talk about populism, right-wing, left-wing, whatever. Just in brackets, before we had that, we had lots of complaints that people were not participating in politics and there was a lot of apathy. That's over, fortunately. It maybe didn't go in the direction that people who complain about apathy wanted to, but at least politics is back, if you like. And the question is, what does this mean for theorizing? Also, there seems to be something like an implementation gap. When you look at issues like climate change or global inequality, global issues of poverty, also poverty and inequality within nations, arguably, lots of normative theories arrive at the same or roughly the same conclusions, and what's lacking is steps towards implementation. Now, you might say, maybe that's just not the tasks of theorists to think about this. But you could also argue that there are maybe problems that have to do more with institutions or maybe also practices of politics than with principles. We've lots of theories about principles. Maybe now is a good time to turn to institutions and practices and the question of how these principles can actually be implemented. So the questions we need to ask, if we assume, and that's something I do assume, I have a background in Hegel studies, so that's something I would never give up, that there should be some kind of connection between political theorizing and the political issues of one's time. Then we need to ask two kinds of questions. So one is, what do our theories actually emphasize and what do they leave out? And emphasizing something and leaving out something else doesn't mean that what you emphasize is wrong or anything. It just means that there is a blind spot somewhere. And also another question is, what level of theorizing can help us to respond to the issues of our time? And what level of abstraction do we actually need to get a grasp on what's going on? I'm not going to question the premise here, but I'm going to come back to this at the end, namely whether political theory, political philosophy can have any impact on political realities or any predictable impact. There might be very unpredictable and uncontrollable forms of influence, but if you cannot predict and control them, then in a way you cannot be held responsible for them. But what lots of people think is, well, there's some way in which political ideas that are developed in theorizing can have an impact on political life, and this notion of theories being action guiding very much relies on that idea. As I said, I'm going to bracket it for now. I'm going to briefly come back at the end. If you really take a bird's eye view of the current landscape in normative theorizing, you have various fields, and they all can add something to addressing current problems, but they also have some weaknesses, I would say. So this is, as I said, a bit polemical, but if you look at critical theory, they have great strength when it comes to analyzing current issues. When you look at who's actually writing about what's currently going on in politics, often critical theorists are the first ones to go there. They are pretty close to social reality. They often draw on sociology, ethnography, whatever. I would say that one issue there is that often they are critical, they are not constructive in the sense that they offer any kind of normative or explicitly normative proposals. So you read these wonderful books, you get to the end and you're, now where's the chapter about what to do? And the chapter never comes. Also, this is just an observation, it's not a criticism, but a lot of critical theory at the moment focuses on issues of gender and race, and those are hugely important, but there is not so much discussion of economic issues. And yes, I know there are exceptions. We can discuss these later if you want. As I said, this is the broad picture, and I can list people who are doing economic issues in critical theory, but as a general pattern, I think that's fair to say. Now, in the analytic camp, in contrast, you have sort of two strands, liberalism and republicanism as two big normative frameworks at the moment. Liberalism is very much focusing on rights and on just distributions of rights and other issues. And one criticism that Honora O'Neill was one of the first to point out, which I think is very important, is that it doesn't focus so much on duties, on who actually has duties to make sure that these rights are granted to individuals, or maybe also to groups. And again, it focuses very much on the principles of distribution, but not so much on the institutions of how you would get these distributions about. It's often at a very high level of abstractions, and what remains unexplored here is actually what are the very practical conditions of the possibility of realizing all these ideals, having a liberal society as it's sketched in these very beautiful ideal theory proposals. What does it take to put this into practice? That's not the focus. Republicanism, in the sense of neo-republicanism, drawing on history of ideas, but then also developing all these accounts of non-domination, it has a stronger sense of focusing on duties in the sense of the shared responsibility of citizens for the polis. That's built into the very notion of a republican demos in a way. But also, this issue of the level of abstraction being quite high, that's comparable to the writers in the more liberal or justice camp. or you have historical work that traces the history of ideas. So although you do have focus on institutions, on an abstract level, and on duties, what you don't have so much is the concrete task for citizens in today's situation. That remains pretty unexplored. And again, I know there are exceptions, and we can talk about different approaches. This is really meant to be the big picture. Now, one hypothesis that I have, and it's in a way an empirical hypothesis about the sociology and history of ideas, is that much of this abstract level of theorizing and also the lack of a rich, meaningful social ontology has to do with the fact that there has been a lot of conversation, methodologically speaking, on the methodology of issues between economists and normative theorists, but not so much between philosophers and ethnographers, sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, other social scientists that also explore the social world. And if you take economic sociology as given, you end up with methodological individualism, and at least as a starting point, and you end up with pretty abstract conceptions of institutions. And I have this picture of a market here. If you ask an economist what a market is, this is usually what comes to their mind. It's an abstract diagram of supply and demand curves, and an equilibrium price in the middle. If that's how you imagine markets, then you overlook all kinds of important questions about market power, about discrimination, about different goods, the different legal situations, and so on. And it's that kind of abstract institutional thinking that I think has influenced a lot of normative theorizing. So what this also means is that you have a pretty narrow concept of market power or state power. It's very often this dichotomy of coercion in the state and voluntary exchanges in the market. And that's just very, very abstract and naive, because there can be voluntary state action, there can be coerced situations in markets, there can be all kinds of in-between situations. And I think we need to get away from these implicit pictures. And one other point, which I'm not going to dwell on, but I think it's important to keep in mind, I think lots of theories of justice in particular have actually an implicit reliance on the economy growing, and there being some kind of growing pie that you can redistribute in some way. And we might be in a non-growth world, at least in the Western countries. We maybe also have normative reasons not to rely on economic growth for ecological reasons. So this implicit assumption of economic growth, I think, is something we should be careful about. And if you want to endorse it, we need to defend it. We cannot just take it over from implicit judgments that come through economic models. So what are we supposed to do? And when I finished the last book, and I was sort of in the state of mind where you think, okay, what's the next thing I want to work on? I tried to figure out my own intuitions about how we could theorize a bit differently and what this would take. And Republican functionalism, as I said, it's a title that may not be the best title, but it's a proposal for doing things a little bit differently. And the basic question at the core of it, I think, is which functions are needed in complex modern societies to uphold citizens' freedom and the institutional structures that can prevent domination? That, for me, turned out to be the crystallizing point for many of the questions that I had been thinking about. It means that you can have, or you should have, a sociologically rich notion of institutions. And by the way, the reason why I haven't gone for the title institutionalism so far is that when you say institutionalism, people very often only focus on formal institutions. But I think we need to take formal and informal institutions, culture, habits, ways of thinking into account as well. And calling them informal institutions is a sort of a helpless way of trying to acknowledge, yes, these things are important. By focusing on functions, we can maybe, from the very beginning, avoid focusing only on formal institutions. Iris Marignan's notion of structure is, I think, very helpful for thinking about all the different kinds of influences that can be had. And in order to explore these kinds of things, it's almost inevitable that you collaborate with social sciences, and probably, that's something I haven't quite done yet, but I'm very interested in, also with humanities, because if you assume that culture matters, for example, then you have reasons to think that people's interpretation of issues matter, and then you're immediately in the realm of hermeneutical readings of important texts, for example, and so on, and you're back in the fields of humanities. And I think there's potential for exploring issues, for example, pictures of what it means to be a good market participant that draw on literature, history, and so on. Also, what I think is very important is that in that kind of approach, we are really sensitive to the cultural and technological conditions of modern societies. That's especially something where republicanism sometimes seems to be at risk of relying on a somewhat simplified picture of the ancient Greek polis, where you have everyone gathering in the market square and so on. That's not the way we run democracies today. And there are probably good reasons not to want to go back, not only because it was just white male and so on, but also because there are advantages of size and complexity, but there are, of course, also risks of size and complexity. And the question is how we can integrate these into our accounts. And in a global world also means that we cannot just stop our considerations at the boundaries of nation states, but also need to ask questions about what goes on beyond, of course. So, what this means is that I'm trying to argue here for a pretty holistic approach, but of course you cannot do everything at once, at least not when you're on your own. I'm a big fan of co-authoring for that very reason, because it gets so complicated, but I think the way in which the division of labor between different theories then should function is more via different fields. So certain people look at, say, the role of money. Other people look at the role of education. Other people look at markets and so on. So you have different functions, different institutions, but when you look at these, you try to take into account all relevant insights from different fields that might be relevant for that area. And you cannot just say, oh, that was written by a sociologist, so I'm not going to read it. I mean, that's sort of what the publication system is forcing us to do, but I think from a scholarly perspective, that's actually really bad. And I think we should try as a discipline and as a profession to get beyond that and try to really think about the division of labor, not so much by, okay, that comes from sociology, that comes from psychology, but more, what's the phenomenon we want to explore and which insights from which disciplines are helpful for doing that. So, a few delineations in order to avoid misunderstandings. So, I'm not claiming that what I'm doing here is in any way completely new. There is this strand of non-ideal theorizing in normative theory that does many of these things. There are, of course, the classics, Hegel, pragmatism, also Thomas Miller's work on teleological approaches to institutions. I think I got a lot from that, and I think there should be more work in that line, and we could talk about how exactly it's different or similar, but for me it was an important inspiration. It's also not incompatible with liberal values. Sometimes the debate between republicanism and liberalism is presented as something about incompatible values. I think that's a mistake, and I can give you the details of that if you want. I think the main focus here is the institutional conditions of the possibility of different forms of freedom. I don't think you can reduce freedom to one of these many concepts that have been proposed in recent years. I think you need many of them, at least three. And I think in that sense, it's not saying, look, you all got it wrong. It's more, okay, you need a different focus in order to talk about implementation. And I think in many cases, the way in which liberalism and institutionalism then, or functionalism then relate to each other is that we need to take into account individuals' rights as constraints on proposals that have to do with certain functions. So even if, say, the best way of providing, I don't know, nourishment for citizens would be to, well, not slaughter babies, but whatever. I mean, you know the old proposal of Irish children being turned into stew. That's not what functionalism is supposed to do, because we have individual rights as constraints. And often that's the way in which you can then look at concrete questions and ask, okay, what's the function that needs to be fulfilled by this institution? And then very soon after that, the second question is, well, but what are the individual rights that are at stake here, that are constraints on what we can say about these institutions? Another slide on what Republican functionalism is not. So one difficult question, I think, is in what sense certain values are treated as ultimate and intrinsic and others are treated as instrumental to these. Now, if you say functionalism, people might think, well, this is all instrumentalist and who knows what's at the end of it, what's really intrinsically valuable. I think sometimes you can actually have a combination of both. If you have reasons to think that certain values or certain practices or certain functions are instrumentally valuable, that doesn't exclude the possibility that they are also intrinsically valuable. The advantage of focusing on the instrumental side is that the intrinsic side might cause a lot of disagreement among people who would actually agree on the instrumentalist side. So, but I don't want to say that something like, for example, democracy or truth is only an instrument in order to prevent domination or something like that. I think that's just taking the dichotomy between instrumental and intrinsic too far. It's also, arguably, I hope, not perfectionist in the sense that it would glorify some kinds of virtues, civic virtues, for example. You probably know that in the Republican camp there is this divide between people who really focus on citizenship as an intrinsically valuable activity that belongs to what it means to lead a good life and so on, and there is a camp that says more, well, we need citizens to have certain virtues and to engage in certain activities in order to uphold a Republican polis. I'm in that second camp, where what matters is that, well, we need to have certain values, virtues, principles, and so on in place in order to analyze the conditions of the possibility of individuals with very different values that they otherwise have living together. So I would argue it's compatible with a very broad pluralism of values. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. Also, it's not automatically a top-down theory that would focus on state activity or so. There can be centralized and decentralized functions. You can have certain kinds of markets that are functional for what they are supposed to do, and they can be totally decentralized, or you can have decentralized enforcement of certain social norms. So there is no presupposition that either centralized or decentralized institutions are better just because it's called functionalism. Now, turning to the positive side, what does it try to do? As I said, it tries to take seriously the conditions of modernity. So we have social differentiation, we have bureaucratization, marketization, the ecological constraints of our planet, and you need to try to integrate these into the way in which we think about institutions. I think it's a horrible thing if climate ethics is just a separate field and then all the other fields do different things and don't talk about the climate, for example, or other urgent issues. Another thing that you do get when you take this approach is that you don't have a clear, previously defined sense of this is private, this is public. No, this is actually up to debate. Some things might have to be reconsidered, that we considered private so far actually have to be public because of the functions that they fulfill in society. And some things that we treated as public might actually be better put into the private realm. This is totally up for debate. And I would argue this includes most property rights. Maybe not all property rights, maybe your private family album and your toothbrush is for you. But most other property rights, I would argue, are not per se private and therefore untouchable. And that also implies that an important issue here is to get rid of a picture according to which whenever you need large-scale coordination, the best tool is to just go for a free market. That's an intuition that no one would ever explicitly endorse, but it's still, I think, quite prevalent implicitly. Namely, whenever it's large and complex, let it be run by a market, because a market can do decentralized coordination. Again, so the aim here would be instead to develop accounts of good institutions, and here I'm stealing from Schrems-Müller again, in contrast to corrupt or corroded institutions. I think it's quite telling in terms of the relation between theorizing and the political issues of our time that the debate about corruption has been growing quite massively in recent years. For example, here's an account by Emanuela Geva and Maria Paola Ferretti. They describe corruption as behavior that goes against the rationale of the public order. And of course they have a bit more to say about it, but it actually remains pretty abstract, and it's not quite clear how you would define this rationale of the public order for different institutions, maybe also differently in different countries and so on. So it doesn't really give you concrete guidance for political reform or for individual behavior or for anything. So, and I mean, I said this already, importantly, we need to take into account globalization and climate change when we think about institutions, even institutions that may seem pretty functional and in good shape. If we only focus on these institutions, may be pretty dysfunctional if we take into account these broader conditions. Now, given that this is a social ontology conference, I try to think a bit about what social ontology I have in mind here, if there's anything like this. But again, I'm still lacking a clear-cut definition of social ontology, and that's why what I'm saying here may not speak to everyone in the room, but I wanted to give it a try at least. One pretty obvious point is that individuals are here seen as more than utility maximizing consumers. Again, not something that people explicitly endorse, but that is arguably implicit in quite a few theories. And I would say it tries to respect a potentially very deep pluralism of values. And it doesn't take preference satisfaction in an economic sense to be of primary importance. That's one way in which you might think about the function of institutions. Certain institutions have the function to satisfy preferences, but that's not like the account of human nature that we should presuppose in all areas of human life. When you look, for example, at certain economic theories of voting, it's all about preference satisfaction, and neither the preferences nor exactly what the satisfaction of them would be are spelled out in detail. It's just these basically formal models that are being used to describe politics. And I mean, they may get some things right, but they also leave out many, many things. And now this is maybe a little bit autobiographical here, but when I was starting to work on this, there was one sentence in a book on something completely different that I'm not going to bore you with, that really struck a chord with me that I wanted to share with you. So this is from Haskell writing about professions. And he has this quote saying, "Where the liberation stopped, if the entire social universe was given over to competing selves, none acknowledging any standard higher than his or her desires." And I think that captures a pretty big problem with lots of rational choice theorizing, and I think that's something we should try to avoid. Now, you may wonder, what is the social versus the individual here? And my sort of quick answer, which I'm happy to expand in the Q&A, is I would like to start from normative individualism in the sense that I think that for many, many questions, the vulnerability of individuals, the way in which individuals' dignity, but also their lives, their health can be harmed, that's really what gets us going, normatively speaking. Whereas many groups, they can be harmed, but it only matters insofar as individuals are in the end harmed. And that's the normative starting point. But because human beings are embedded in social institutions still matter a lot. And lots of harms to individuals are actually done via harms to groups, to institutions, and so on. So in that sense, social phenomena are hugely important. And one thing that I find extremely interesting and also extremely puzzling and difficult, but I think that it needs more attention, is really the cultural embeddedness of individuals and how their cultural background matters for their identities. Crucial questions then are, which social phenomena form what kinds of constraints of normative theorizing? So what do I mean here? Certain social phenomena are changeable, and they could just be abolished and you could set them up differently. Other social phenomena seem pretty stubborn, and you cannot just change them. Whenever you make a normative proposal, you need to think about these social phenomena as feasibility conditions. So for example, in political science, there has been a lot of debate about this iron law of oligarchy, not oligarchy. So whenever you have a large institution, there will be an elite that will try to gather more power than the rest of it, something like that. If you assume that this is sort of, maybe not a law, but a general tendency of groups, that there tends to be a concentration of power, unless you do something against it, then this is something that you need to take into account when you do normative theorizing. Or if you assume that all groups will develop certain kinds of culture, certain patterns, certain mutual assumptions, and so on, then that's again something you need to take into account. You cannot have any normative proposals that assume culture-free institutions. That just wouldn't be realistic and therefore not very useful. And something that I find very interesting and important from the perspective I've been suggesting is how are changes on the level of formal and informal institutions related? And when I say informal institutions, that includes what has been entitled the construction of social reality by concepts, by ideas, and so on. If we change formal institutions, but don't change, or maybe cannot change, it's not so clear how this happens, informal institutions, then this can go very, very badly wrong. Think about democracy export, how there was this idea driven by a powerful country that you could just come to other countries, implant democratic institutions, and then they will be happy ever after. Didn't work out quite that way. It did work out in some cases, and there's a lot of debate on why it worked in some and not in other cases. But arguably, what matters for importing democracy in another country is not only formal institutions, but also ways of thinking, social habits, ways in which people acknowledge each other as co-citizens, and so on. And so, when you want to push for change, there's always this question, well, what changes need to happen on the formal level, and what changes need to happen on the informal level, and how are they related? And I think that's something we could all maybe pay more attention to, because that seems to be such an obstacle. Some people argue only on the level of informal, and some people argue only on the level of formal, but in practice, it's the interaction of both that matters. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief sketch of how I want to take this approach to one particular area, namely, if you like, political epistemology, which is now this new field. There has been social epistemology for a while now, it's political epistemology. And I'm just plugging in epistemic here into my general question for Republican functionalism, so which epistemic functions are needed in complex modern societies to uphold citizens' freedom and the institutional structures that can prevent domination. And I mean, there's a lot going on at the moment, like all this distrust of experts, fake news, the way in which internet news consumption shapes politics, that shows that there is something pretty deep going wrong in the way in which knowledge and expertise and informations are dealt with in our democratic systems, and that's what I want to look at here. One intuition I have is that one basic mistake, and that's again one that is sort of both on the formal and on the informal level, is that knowledge has often been understood as a production factor for capitalist systems. So when you look at production functions, the way economists do them, often knowledge or skills or something is just one of the factors, and it's sort of attached to individuals. And I think that's pretty problematic. It's also very problematic that patent law and copyright law have used that kind of conception of what knowledge is and legally enforced it to a great extent. And there's a lot going on if you start looking at patent law, and it has direct implications for distributive justice and so on. And I think that's something that we need to address, because knowledge is not only important for as a factor of production, it also matters very much for democracy's ability to govern themselves. If you think about democracy as people together governing their own affairs, they need to know about their own affairs, and if this knowledge is being appropriated by corporations or other private agents, that's a challenge. So, and the second big challenge that got me thinking about this is that you have this fundamental tension between moral equality in democracies. We assume that every citizen has the same moral value, and there's no hierarchy between someone being more valuable than someone else. But we also have epistemic diversity. People know different things. They have practical knowledge, know-how, they have experiential knowledge. And so in a sense, in very many areas, there is unequal epistemic authority. And if you doubt this, then ask yourself whether you'd rather have an operation by a surgeon who was trained and has some experience in doing that operation, or whether you wouldn't mind have it done by a philosophy professor or whatever. So I think it's pretty clear that we have differentiated knowledge, and that this matters. And it also matters, for example, if you have oppressed minorities talking about their experiences, they have more epistemic authority reporting about that than someone who's just read about it on the internet for half an hour. So there are very different kinds of expertise and knowledge, and this diversity matters. But the question is, how do we deal with it if at the same time we want to keep up the ideal of moral equality? Now, as I said, this is going to be very sketchy, but I'm going to at least give you some elements of what I think needs to be part of an answer. I think we cannot get rid of some notion of truth versus falsehood. I mean, there's a lot of debate in postmodern camps about how truth is just another tool of oppression, the notion of truth. I don't think this is correct. I think we need some notion of truth, otherwise we are running into even worse forms of oppression. Also, I think we need a distinction between common knowledge that should be accessible to everyone, that should be widely shared, that must not be appropriated, and then expert knowledge of various kinds. I mean, I said a bit already, there's local knowledge, experiential knowledge, expert knowledge in the classical sense of just getting an education, having long times of training and so on. And I think these two both are part of the picture, and of course there's a lot somewhere in between. And we need to think both about what we can all share and what should be shared, but then also be realistic about what cannot be shared, because it's just too specific and we need a division of labor for it. So what I think here is we need a dual approach. And this won't be a surprise because I talked about this already. We need to talk about formal institutions, so there are questions about regulation. What forms of knowledge can be privately appropriated? What needs to be in the public domain? What kind of incentives for knowledge creation are there? And so on, and what legal regulations do we have? But especially for knowledge, it's never enough to rely on formal institutions, because, I mean, unless you torture people, usually you need them to volunteer to share certain forms of knowledge. And that means, I think, that for democracies, a democratic ethos needs to be accompanied by a certain ethos of knowledge, both with regard to common knowledge and with regard to expert knowledge. And that's something that I hope to work out in more detail in the future. So just briefly, some areas that need to be analyzed here: ownership of knowledge, regulation of media, and this is the final point, the institutional structures for and also the self-understanding and ethos of those who produce knowledge or transmit knowledge or work with knowledge. In a previous version of the talk, I used the term knowledge producers, but then someone pointed out, well, this is actually a very capitalist notion. Knowledge producers is exactly sticking to the paradigm of the individual producing knowledge for their own gain and so on, that I want to get beyond. So I'm putting this here in more general terms, but people do deal with knowledge, and the question then is, okay, what does this mean? If they want to be Democrats, committed to an ethos of equality, but still being expert in certain fields, how do you square the circle? And this, I think, also applies to philosophers. And here it's sort of going full circle, and I'm coming back to the point that I left hanging at the beginning. I think the approach that I'm here taking has implications for how we do political philosophy, no matter whether you write about these kinds of issues or about something else. So one question that arises from what I've said so far is, well, what is the underlying ontology we are actually presupposing in the way in which we do philosophy? And also, whose interests might our theories serve? So how do we locate our own theorizing in a social universe, which of course presupposes that we have some kind of picture of that social universe, which is the question about the underlying ontology. And also, who do I write for and how do I write for these people? And I think, a lot could be said here about what's working well and what's working not so well in this respect, but I want to just focus on one last point here, which is that I think one could argue that the regulative ideal is that one should do philosophy not only sort of as a citizen of the Republic of Letters, i.e. for other academics, but also as a citizen of the republics that we live in a broader sense. And in that sense, there is a question about how we philosophize given the current political issues, given the crisis of democracy, given all the misunderstandings about ontology that are around. And I think that is a debate we need to have in our discipline about how we philosophize given all that's going on. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.